So this is the first in a series of videos I'm going to be doing, working our way through Othello and trying to codify some of the ideas and stuff that we look at in lessons and trying to make sure that we've sort of dug into some of the minutiae. So today we're looking at the first part of Act 1, Scene 1, which is going to take us up to about line 80, so basically the entry of. The first thing I'd like to say is I absolutely love the way that Othello begins. If we compare it to the prologue of Romeo and Juliet, or the manoeuvring in King Lear, or the claustrophobic paranoia of Hamlet, or even the villainous soliloquy of Richard III, they're all grandiose and have this sense of moment and occasion. Here we have two blokes rowing in the middle of the night in the middle of the street, and that immediately creating that tension between private and public as well. They're having a very personal conversation, but in a private place, but that in a public place even, but that public place giving them a sense of anonymity, so creating that illusion of privacy, which will ultimately come round again to when Desdemona is lying dead in her marital bed, which should be the most private places, and it becomes a very public forum with half the cast, quite frankly, tramping through there. But what this also serves to do is establish the scale of the tragedy immediately. This isn't going to be a play about affairs of state. This is two angry men railing at what they perceive as injustice. I've always sort of talked about this play as an excellent example of toxic masculinity and male entitlement. I'm a bit concerned about that phrase, toxic masculinity, these days, but I think it does have its place. The types of men or masculinity that are embodied by Iago and Roderigo are very dangerous and destructive in a lot of ways. And what we see is that both Iago and Roderigo feel cheated and want revenge. And what we immediately begin with in this line from Roderigo, who gets the first line, beginning in medias res, we're beginning in the middle of this story, this image of Iago with his purse strings. Iago pulling the strings from the very first speech, this image of him as almost like this puppeteer. And I think it's really interesting that Roderigo seems to be aware of this manipulation, but still allows it, which gives us an immediate example of just how effective Iago is, which is obviously going to be helpful to him later on. And by starting mid-argument, Shakespeare's making us race to keep up, and it's a race that we run throughout the play. The references that we get to him later on, thou toldst me thou didst hold him in thy hate, require inference to identify. We're not sure who they're talking about, and as it moves on, we develop this perception or presumption that it's Othello. We're having to figure out what's going on at every moment of the way. Now, Iago's presentation of Othello is very negative, where it tells us here as loving his own pride and purposes, for example. But it's immediately refuted by the arrival of the tragic hero in Act 1, Scene 2, which I think means that Shakespeare always wants us to question Iago's honesty at any moment. What exactly is the truth, and how much of anything that Iago says does he even actually believe in? Cassio is dismissed beautifully as a great arithmetician who only knows bookish theory. But again, this is somewhat refuted later in the play when the Venetian state decide to appoint Cassio as Othello's successor in Cyprus. So we're constantly being shown right from the start that Iago's judgment and opinions heavily skewed. And so that means we're constantly wrong-footed throughout the play, because we often get Iago's point of view first, and who gets their story in first gets that sort of dominance in our head, and then we have to self-correct all the time and see how this changes. We also get the first indication of Iago's motivations, in this case professional jealousy, as he tells us, I am worth no words a place. And we are forced to consider how true that is, and again, how honest he's being. We almost later could perhaps infer that he feels he must blame Othello and Cassio rather than consider his own shortcomings, and perhaps he simply was not good enough for this job. This reason is contradicted in the Act 1, Scene 3 soliloquy that closes the act, where he confesses to the audience his fear of cuckoldry. But obviously he can't admit this to another man. Here he's not speaking to himself. We have this monologue where he is aligning his values with Roderigo. We could argue that Coleridge's motiveless malignity springs from this inconsistency where Iago has this surfeit of motives. But for me, it actually makes sense. It seems like Iago is hiding wounded pride, not to set myself up against Coleridge, but Iago to me seems to be hiding some sort of wounded pride in front of Roderigo and replacing the type of jealousy. So moving from sexual to professional because that's more publicly acceptable. And again, that tension between public and private. So having established this idea of almost this theme of a personal vendetta, wrongs that must be righted, we now need to have a think about Iago's self-characterization and how he presents himself here. There's a lot of overtones of Richard III in him for me, that great tragic hero who comes on stage in his opening soliloquy in the play and declares that he is determined to prove a villain to while away these farewell spoken days. And I think there's an element of that here. But it's important that Iago isn't speaking directly to the audience. The presence of Roderigo necessarily affects the way that Iago presents himself. And Iago is a chameleon to a lot of extents. He definitely changes his characterization depending on who he is. So in this section here, we see him telling us the preferment goes by letter and affection and not by old gradation. So again, we're back at this idea of Iago's motivation. He feels cheated of his rightful place as Othello's lieutenant. Is part of his revenge motivated by betrayal? Is this the first betrayal in there? And that forces us to question how close he and Othello were previously, and we'll come on to that a little. Because previously in his earlier speech, he tells us the idea that he and Othello have known each other, have fought alongside each other, and therefore feels he had earned this place. It's really interesting that Othello's apparent preference for a meritocratic system is apparently so controversial. We might assume that as an African in Venice, Othello has had to earn his position and now expects others to do the same rather than waiting their turn and not just where each second stood heir to the first. We then to the second of Iago's big speeches, his big monologues. Remember, he's delivering this to Roderigo. And one of those rare moments, I think, of honesty in Othello, in Iago even, where he tells us, I follow him to serve my turn upon him. And I feel here we can be quite certain of Iago's honesty. Again, we've got obvious echoes of Richard III. And it's interesting that Shakespeare is making this connection to an earlier charismatic villainous character. Richard III predates Othello. The lowest social status of Iago, however, opens up new opportunities while using the same dramatic tricks to forge a relationship with the audience, because audiences love a baddie. So when he's telling us right at the start, I'm here to be a problem, he makes us interested in that character. And it also puts Othello at a disadvantage before he even appears on the stage. It's interesting that our titular hero is always at the mercy of dramatic irony. The audience is always ahead of him. And perhaps that makes the tragic hero harder to sympathise with. I'll talk a lot in the coming videos about the idea of distancing between the audience and Othello. He's not a character we actually feel we get to know very well. I love Iago's contemptuous assessment of society here, where he's talking about this many a duteous and knee-crooking knave, and dismissing these honourable, dedicated men in such a way, and they're being stuck in this obsequious bondage, which has this sense of almost like their own choice to be enslaved in this gratitude and sense of duty. It's so scathing that he makes these positive, arguably positive traits of duty and honour seem repellent. And we find ourselves congratulating Iago as he describes those who perform shows of service and do themselves homage. Most interestingly, he does say these fellows have some soul. The religious imagery attached to such immoral behaviour gets to the heart of Iago's duplicity, I think. And then we get that final killer line, I am not what I am, which obviously has our echoes of God's declaration in Exodus. But it's that paradox of Iago being very honest about his deceptive nature that really exposes the complexity of the character. Shakespeare ensures that we know to question everything from this point on, and Iago is very clearly marked as our most interesting character at this point. Finally, for this section, we have a couple of interesting moments with Roderigo particularly introducing this racial epithet here, where he describes Othello as the thick lips. Now, again, one of the things I always think is interesting is the question of exactly how racist we might call Iago. It's very clear that we have Roderigo is using this, it feels like a real racial insult here, and it's painfully obvious that Brabantio, who's going to appear, is racist. But as Othello's position in society suggests, that's not necessarily universal in Venice. So we always have to ask ourselves if Iago is playing up the race card to maximise the chaos he can create. At this point in the play, Iago is at his most directionless. He just wants to cause upset. And his desire to poison his delight means that he is going to do whatever problems he can. We also see that in this speech here, where he's instructing Roderigo to call up her father, and we see this big chain of imperatives reminding us who really is in charge in this pairing. Remember, these two would be a bit of an odd sight on stage together. The younger Roderigo, significantly higher social status, with this knockabout soldier who is always cast older and a variety of olders. And we see also in this speech the fact that the he and the him and the his in this can apply as equally to Brabantio as it can to Othello. It demonstrates that Iago at this point is just having fun by causing discord. So it makes sense that he would say and do whatever would maximise that effect, perhaps including playing up his disapprobation even for Othello and Desdemona's marriage, and whether that is on those terms. And we end this section here with the notes with the repetition of this idea of thieves, 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 look to your house, your daughter, and your bags. So he's yelling thieves 5 times, he's causing chaos, he's making as much ruckus as he can, and he is talking about Desdemona as having been stolen. And therefore we have this idea that Desdemona is being inextricably connected with that idea of possession. So we're immediately seeing that treatment of women, and that is important, because if women belong to men, then it is okay to use them to get at the men they belong to. They're not people in their own right for some of the men in this play. They are here to cause as much of a problem as we can, and to be used as a weapon against them, which I think is worth thinking about. The last thing I'd draw your attention to is the idea of Roderigo's relationship with Iago being somewhat of a proto-Othello. We're seeing a presumably well-educated, young, upper-class man of Venice who is entirely taken in and under Iago's direction. I think that's really important, because it's important for us to see that this works on more than one person, so that Othello doesn't just seem absurd or overly credulous. We have to see that Iago is this master manipulator, so we have to see that he's already been doing this before. Okay, so that takes us up to the end of this section of part 1. The next video is going to look at the rest of Act 1, Scene 1, and see what happens when Brabantio is introduced. Okay, see you then.